Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, where we explore history's greatest sieges. If you know somebody that enjoys this genre of history, please share the podcast with them. In the early 16th century, the Ottoman Empire stood as the most dominant military force on Earth. The conquest of Constantinople had shattered the last remnants of the Eastern Roman Empire, and Ottoman armies surged across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa with relentless speed. No power could match their expansion. Kingdoms that had once defied them now paid tribute. Christendom itself, fractured and weakened by internal strife, had lost the will for unified resistance. The balance of power had shifted, and the world belonged to the empire of the Sultan. But on the edge of the Ottoman dominion, beyond the reach of compromise and diplomacy, stood a single order of warriors. Men who had no kingdom, no nation, no ruler but their own. They had already lost everything once. Driven from their last stronghold, abandoned by the powers of Europe, they had been cast into exile, surviving only by sheer force of will. Yet they refused to disappear. They carved out a new home, not in the heart of Christendom, but in the jaws of the enemy. Their presence alone was an insult to Ottoman supremacy. For decades, they waged war from their island stronghold, striking at the empire's lifeblood. Its trade, its fleets, its sense of invincibility, and for that, they were marked for destruction. The empire would send its full might to wipe them from existence, to extinguish them so completely that they would never rise again. The siege that followed was more than a battle for territory. It was a contest of endurance, a reckoning between the old world and the new. Had the defenders fallen, the Mediterranean would have been left open to unchecked Ottoman expansion. Christian Europe, already fractured, might never have recovered. The wars that defined the coming centuries, the great naval clashes, the battle for supremacy between East and West, those would have played out on very different terms. The outcome of this single campaign shaped the wars that followed, determined the borders of empire, and decided whether the Mediterranean would remain contested or become an Ottoman sea. This was not a fight for conquest. It was a fight for survival, and when the storm came, the world watched to see if a handful of warriors could hold the line against an empire. Let's now experience the Siege of Rhodes.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, Episode 27, The Siege of Rhodes, from the 28th of July to the 21st of December, 1522. Turkish forces, unknown but reportedly as many as 100,000 soldiers. Knights of St. John, 500 knights and sergeants, possibly up to 6,000 Rhodian citizen militia. With the fall of the city and the island, Suleiman secured uncontested Ottoman dominance over the eastern Mediterranean. No Christian stronghold remained to challenge his fleets. No force lingered to disrupt his empire's control over these waters. The sea, once a battleground, was now an Ottoman domain, its trade routes and strategic ports firmly in the Sultan's grasp.
The Order of the Knights of the Hospital of St. John, the famed Knights Hospitaller, rose from the chaos of the First Crusade, men forged in battle yet sworn to the duty of healing. Within the walls of Jerusalem, they tended the sick and the wounded, but make no mistake, these were warriors as much as they were caretakers. Their purpose was singular: to defend Christendom with steel and shield, to carry their faith forward by any means necessary. They were the sword in the darkness, the mailed fist of Christian Europe. When Jerusalem fell back into Muslim hands, the knights didn't wait for slaughter. They withdrew to Acre, the last Christian stronghold in the Holy Land, planting their banner there for what would become a final, desperate stand. Acre burned. After 6 weeks of unrelenting siege in 1291, Muslim forces stormed the city, cutting down knights, priests, and civilians alike. Few escaped, but those who did were hardened men, scarred by loss, retreating to Italy, not to surrender, but to rebuild, to avenge, and to rise again. In 1307, the mightiest of the Christian military orders, the Knights Templar, were crushed under the boot of King Philip IV of France. It was a calculated strike, a purge, meant to strip the church of its most powerful warriors. The Hospitallers saw the writing on the wall. They vanished before Philip's grasp could close around them, slipping away before they too were dragged into the dungeons of Paris. Displaced but unbroken, the Knights of St. John set their sights on Rhodes, an island of stone and sea, a natural fortress, a launchpad for the war they were determined to continue. Exile had forced the Hospitallers to evolve. No longer just warriors of the land, they became masters of the sea. Rhodes was no mere refuge, it itself was a weapon. From its shores, they struck at Muslim fleets, choking Ottoman trade, turning the eastern Mediterranean into a hunting ground where they were the predators, and every Muslim merchant vessel was the prey. They took Rhodes by force, seized it with fire and sword, and when the dust settled, Pope Clement V made it official in 1309. The island belonged to the Knights, and with it, their order was reborn. For 200 years, they were the terror of the Ottoman seas. Turkish captains cursed their name. Muslim merchants sailed in fear. No ship was safe, no port beyond their reach. The Hospitallers had become something more than warriors. They were a plague upon the empire of Islam. Then came Sultan Mehmed, a force of nature, a warlord who took the shattered remnants of the Ottoman Empire and forged them into an unrelenting machine of conquest. In 1453, he seized Constantinople, and from that moment, his ambition knew no limits. Southeast Europe, Anatolia, the frontiers of Persia, everywhere he marched, he took. No army could stop him. The Knights had made themselves too great a nuisance. Mehmed had no patience for gnats that bit at his empire. In 1480, he sent his army to Rhodes to swat them from existence. Under the command of Mesich Pasha, the Ottoman war machine crashed against Rhodes from the sea. They came in waves, but the Knights had built their walls to withstand the fury of empires. Stone and steel held fast. Mesich tried again, striking from the land, but the Knights met them with fire and steel. The Ottomans bled for every inch, and in the end, they bled too much. Defeated, they withdrew. The consequences of their victory were felt beyond Rhodes. An Ottoman thrust into Italy faltered, abandoned in the wake of their failure. Had the Knights fallen, who knows how far Mehmed's ambition might have stretched. In Rhodes, Grand Master Fabrizio del Carrero saw what was coming. He knew the Ottomans would return, and when they did, the Knights had to be ready. For decades, he reinforced the walls, deepened the moats, raised towers that loomed like sentinels over the sea. By the time he died in 1521, Rhodes was more than a fortress. It was the most impenetrable stronghold in Christendom. The Knights had not relented. Year after year they raided, seized ships, drained Ottoman gold straight from its coffers. When Suleiman the Magnificent took the throne, he had no intention of tolerating them. In 1522, he gathered his forces. This time, there would be no retreat. Suleiman did not leave this war to his generals. He led the invasion himself. One chronicler, eager to capture the scale of the moment, claimed the force numbered 700 ships and 200,000 men, though the truth was likely closer to half that. Even so, it was an army like no other, a storm of steel marching straight for Rhodes. Unlike the failed attempt in 1480, Suleiman struck from the land, allowing the Knights to resupply and reinforcing their will to resist. The Knights stood behind walls designed for exactly this moment. Del Carrero had ensured it. The defenses were no longer simply barriers, they were weapons. The ditches had been doubled, the walls thickened beyond reason, their height raised to cast shadows over the battlefield. Each sector of the defenses was held by a different lang of the order, divided by national origin. Every man knew his post. Every man knew what was at stake. Suleiman was no fool. He saw the walls, measured their strength, and chose another path. Beneath the earth, his miners clawed their way forward, ready to tear Rhodes down from below. But the Knights had their own weapon. Venetian engineer Gabriele Tedini de Martinengo, days before the siege, slept into the city, bringing with him an invention of genius. a device of stretched parchment so taut it trembled at the slightest movement. With it, the knights could hear the enemy's progress. They would not be taken unawares. Every move the Ottoman miners made, the knights countered. They collapsed tunnels, sabotaged efforts, turned the enemy's own weapons against them. But the Ottomans had numbers on their side. More men, more mines, more destruction. On September the 4th, the 24th, and November the 30th, they broke through, bringing down sections of the walls in a roar of stone and dust. The Turks poured through those breaches. The knights met them in the wreckage. The battles were brutal, desperate, neither side willing to yield. And when the smoke cleared, Rhodes still stood, but the cost was staggering. Then came the betrayal. In October, Chancellor André Duhamel, the man who had once sought the title of Grand Master himself, was accused of treason. A servant caught him with a message urging the Turks to press the siege, to finish the job. Duhamel was proud, arrogant, a man with no shortage of enemies. Few doubted he was capable of treachery as well. The trial was swift, but the evidence thin. The witnesses were unreliable, their stories suspect. Even under torture, Duhamel refused to speak. No Ottoman records mention his betrayal, no definitive proof exists, but the stain of suspicion was enough. Centuries later, in 1856, a massive explosion tore through the Church of St. John, obliterating the Grand Master's palace. The blast suggested something sinister, a hidden stockpile of gunpowder, stored there in 1522 when supplies were running low. If so, it would have been an act of desperation. Yet Duhamel had never been accused of this crime. He was found guilty and executed, his name tainted forever, though history never proved his guilt. By December, Rhodes was bleeding out. The knights had prepared for a long siege. Ammunition and provisions were meant to last a year, but reality had shattered those plans. The islands under their control had already fallen. Their last mainland bastion at Halicarnassus had crumbled, and reinforcements were nothing more than a distant hope. Unlike in 1480, when the Ottomans had withdrawn with the coming cold, Suleiman showed no mercy to the season. The pressure never let up. The walls were failing, the men were exhausted, and it was only a matter of time. Suleiman had lost thousands, perhaps as many as 15,000 men, to the walls, the swords, and the sheer defiance of the defenders. But he was a pragmatist. Rhodes would fall, but it didn't need to be reduced to ashes. He offered them terms. The citizens of Rhodes, weary of bloodshed, pleaded for acceptance. They had endured enough. Lyle Adam, master of an order on the brink of destruction, had no choice. His council agreed, and the fight was over. On December the 20th, the weapons fell silent. The terms were set. There would be no slaughter, no executions. Rhodes' people would remain, their faith untouched. The knights themselves were granted passage, free to leave, taking with them whatever wealth they could carry. On January 1st, 1523, the Knights of St. John marched to the docks, their banners lowered and their weapons sheathed. They boarded their galleys in silence, a brotherhood now without a home. On Lyle Adams' flagship, a banner rippled in the wind, an image of the Virgin Mary weeping over Christ, with the words, Afflictus tu spes unica rebus. In all which afflicts us, thou art our only hope. Watching them depart, Suleiman is said to have remarked, quote, It saddens me to have to oblige this brave old man leave his home, end quote. The Sultan, though victorious, understood what had been lost. An enemy worthy of respect, a foe that had stood when others would have surely broken. But that mercy, that single moment of magnanimity, would come back to haunt him. 7 years later, the knights found a new stronghold, Malta, and from its rocky shores they rose again, harassing Ottoman fleets, striking at Muslim power in the Mediterranean with a vengeance. Suleiman had driven them from Rhodes, but he had not destroyed them. The last great campaign of Suleiman's reign was against the knights once more, but this time in Malta. It ended in disaster for the Ottomans. Rhodes had been a victory, yes, one that cleared the seas for Muslim trade, that secured Ottoman dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. But it had not crushed the order. The knights had survived, and survival meant war. Had Lyle Adam chose death over surrender, Rhodes would have been reduced to rubble, and the Order of the Knights of St. John would have been nothing more than a memory, extinguished and forgotten. Europe had grown tired. The kings and princes who had once sent armies to defend Christendom now whispered of treaties, of trade, of diplomacy. The fires of the old crusading spirit, once fierce enough to shake the earth, had dimmed to embers. No great fleet sailed to reclaim Rhodes. No armies marched to avenge its loss. The Knights of St. John had been abandoned, exiled, cast adrift in a world that no longer had use for men like them. But they did not fade. They did not yield. On the barren, wind-swept rock of Malta, they built anew. Not just walls of stone, but a will of iron, a purpose that could not be extinguished. They were fewer now, no longer an order of thousands, but every man who remained understood what it meant to stand against the tide of history. They were the last of a dying breed. Warriors who had fought not for wealth, not for crowns, but for a cause, for something greater than themselves. And so, when the Ottoman Empire, vast beyond imagination, sent its greatest armada to erase them from existence, to finish what had begun in Rhodes, the Knights did what no one believed possible. They stood alone, on the edge of annihilation, staring into the abyss. They did not break. They did not bow. And in that moment, against all odds, they changed the course of history forever. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed that episode. Let's descend now into the killing fields of the comment section. On the Battle of Chalon, Legion II AVGCA wrote, actually, late Roman hired the Huns to decimate Goth tribes. In the 420s to 440s, Huns were cheap, 400 pounds of gold, and they killed and obliterated Roman enemies. Attila spent time in Rome and other cities and knew Roman culture. After killing his cousin, he thought the Huns were way underpaid and raised the price from 400 to 800, then 1,200, then 2,000 pounds of gold. When the Eastern Empire said no to 4,000 pounds, Attila destroyed many cities. When he could not squeeze the East anymore, he moved in 449 to the Western Empire that had no money but land. His biggest resistance was Visigoth and Alan forces in Gaul. Roman forces were very weak, and with little gold, his force was more defensive. Well, Legion 2, great points. The Huns were indeed a weapon for the Romans, first wielded before they realized they'd created a monster. They went from mercenaries for hire to empire wreckers. They learned fast just how profitable extortion could be, like all extortionists. Attila wasn't just a warlord, he was a shrewd businessman who understood that Hunnic fear was currency. The Eastern Romans paid up until they didn't. The Western Romans, though, couldn't pay. So he decided to take land instead. And yes, at Chalon it was the Visigoths and the Alans who dealt him the real damage. Rome's contribution was mostly Aetius playing political chess. But by then the empire's strength was in its alliances, not in its legions. Until his army was fighting a campaign that was more about leverage than outright conquest. Had he won decisively, we might be speaking a very different kind of Latin language today, my friend. LT Tacos 2092 wrote on our episode about the Tet Offensive, "Betcha if they all had walkie-talkies, the offensive could have been pulled off." Lieutenant Tacos, thank you for sending that. See, but they did win. Not the individual battles of the Tet Offensive, but the outcome of the war because of the Tet Offensive. Regarding the radios and the individual battles within the bookends of the Tet Offensive, I've heard this one before, if only it were that simple. The Tet Offensive wasn't lost due to a lack of communication. It was lost because of faulty strategy, overwhelming firepower from ARVN and U.S. forces, and The simple fact that the Viet Cong simply weren't nearly as strong as they believed themselves to be. They coordinated nearly 100 attacks across South Vietnam. They did so using couriers, hidden radio networks, and obviously their sheer determination. But no amount of walkie-talkies would have changed the reality. And the reality was this: they were outgunned, they were outmaneuvered, and due to that, they were crushed. The real shock of Tet wasn't their tactical success. It was the psychological impact of the American public, something no radio could have prevented. Thanks for your comment. See you guys tomorrow.